Thank you for joining us. My name is Charles Howard, and I'm here with Steve Laser from Democrats for Progress. Steve, you've been watching this race for the Republican nomination. You watched the returns from New Hampshire. What are your initial thoughts on the results last night?
Well, a couple of things. First, like everybody else, I knew Mitt Romney was going to win the New Hampshire primary. That was never the question. The things that I was most interested in last night, though, were how big would the margin be? And in the crosstabs and exit polls, would Romney poll the most out of any candidate when it came to self-described conservatives? Because that's where Romney has had the most trouble. Romney absolutely needs those voters to want to work for him if he's going to have a chance at prevailing in the general election against President Obama. Now, New Hampshire is basically Mitt Romney's home state. He's the national presumptive front runner. He has the most money. All the advantages are going for him in New Hampshire. You would think in a situation like that Romney would not only be able to win, but that he'd be able to really push up the winning margin and take a huge share of the votes. So I was looking to see if he could exceed 50% of the vote. That, to me, would have been a really impressive margin of victory. Now, if he didn't get 50, the next question I had was, would he get 40% or more of the vote? I really think that in the position that Mitt Romney was in, that he should have been able to exceed 40% of the vote. He didn't do that. So the fact that Romney came in under 40% in what amounts to be his adopted home state and facing an opposition that's fractured and in disarray, to me is a signal of how weak of a candidate he is. Now, it's great to be winning, and winning always beats the alternative. But the object of running for president isn't to win your party's nomination, it's to win the general election. I can talk more about that later, but the margin here tells me that Mitt's a weak candidate polling the best among weak candidates. Now, as I mentioned, the second thing that I was looking for, Charles, last night was whether Romney could win either an outright majority or at least get the most of any candidate in terms of the votes of self-described conservatives. That's a group that Romney has had trouble with in Iowa and is expected to have trouble wherever he's seriously challenged for the nomination. It turns out that Romney polled even with Rick Santorum with self-described conservatives. Now, in any other state, with the possible exception of Massachusetts, if Romney polls even with the top conservative vote getter out of the Santorum, Gingrich, and Perry crowd, you'd have to consider it a good thing. You would expect, though, that in New Hampshire, of all places, he ought to be able to win that demographic, and that result would give him some hope that he could win conservatives, over to his side. But even there, he just can't do it. So the verdict is definitely in. Conservatives don't trust him, and they don't like him. So many things can change over the course of a campaign, but we're 7 or more months in, and Romney's problems with conservatives seems to be something that he's just not going to be able to shake.
I assume that you think he should get credit for being the first Republican in history to win both the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries. Also, does this mean the race for the nomination is effectively over, or can someone stop him?
Yeah, no, there's no question about it. As I said earlier, winning always, always, always beats the alternative, right? A win is a win, and it beats the alternative any day of the week. Winning both Iowa and New Hampshire is impressive from a historical standpoint. There's no question about it. We can't take anything away from Mitt Romney there. It's hard to imagine at this point, speaking of inevitability, when you look at the South Carolina polls and see Mitt leading everyone there by 10 points, how he can be stopped if all three of Perry, Gingrich, and Santorum are still in the race by the time the South Carolina primary happens on January 21st. Mitt's going to get a bounce from his New Hampshire win on top of the already commanding lead. Something really profound has to happen at this point to give anyone else a shot. Now, assuming that Mitt doesn't do or say something really dumb, and that happens in campaigns. The only way Romney can lose in South Carolina is there's some sort of backroom deal, and for instance, Gingrich bows out and endorses Santorum and campaigns for him. That's the only chance that I see for stopping Mitt Romney at this point. If that doesn't happen, Romney wins South Carolina, and then with wins in the Midwest, New England, and the South, I don't see an argument for anyone else winning or staying in the race. It's over at that point. I think Newt Gingrich said something along those lines today. Now, some other folks might stay in past South Carolina, but if Mitt wins that state, it's effectively over, except for the exact delegate count. Incidentally, by the way, it looks Ron Paul does intend to stay in and accumulate delegates.
If Romney does, for practical and intent and purposes, win the South Carolina primary, and in your view becomes the presumptive nominee, how does the race shape up between him and President Obama?
Well, that's exactly the way things are going to turn after South Carolina if Mitt wins. And I have to say, as a Democrat, that I am looking forward to the campaign against any of these folks running for president right now. They all seem to be unelectable in most normal circumstances. I like the idea of facing a candidate like Romney where he does not have the solid backing of the most crucial part of his base. Now, you can claim that, someone has independent and crossover support, but if they don't have the enthusiastic support of the traditional worker bee part of their base, they're going to be in big trouble. Now, the most generally conservative and also the religious right wings of the Republican Party do not like Romney. They didn't like John McCain very much, and look what happened to him, in 2008. They like Romney even less than they like John McCain by several orders of magnitude. Most of the enthusiastic volunteers in the campaigns of Republican presidential candidates in the past have come from the religious right. I've seen plenty of discussions on conservative websites where grassroots conservatives are essentially saying that if Romney wins the nomination, they'll stay out of this election and wait for 2016 and work to get behind a real conservative. I don't want to beat this point into the ground, but there is zero enthusiasm for a Romney nomination on the Republican side. That's why you saw all this chaos over the last 7 months with the base trying out different anti-Romney frontrunners. They want someone else. I don't know how they could make it more clear. I think a lot of the far right are looking around dazed and confused and are asking themselves, how did we get here with Mitt Romney? How did we let this happen? Compare this to if a Democrat won the nomination someday who had crossover and independent support, but had alienated the unions and the African American community, for instance. I don't see how such a Democrat would prevail in the general election. You have to, and this is going to be the lesson going forward, you have to have your base solidly and enthusiastically behind you to win the presidency, particularly to beat an incumbent. Look at the last 2 times an incumbent was beaten. When Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush in '92, and his base was wildly enthusiastic about him. And Ronald Reagan beat Carter in 1980, and his base was similarly very enthusiastic about him. Romney doesn't have that. To emphasize the point, 55% of New Hampshire Republicans say they would be dissatisfied if Mitt Romney is the nominee. How do you win with that? You can't.
Well, what are some of the other problems that Romney would have going up against President Obama, and what would happen in that race?
Yeah, there's actually a lot to talk about there. I'll try to condense it. The base issue by itself that I was talking about is really all he needs to be unelectable, but it does get worse for Romney. First off, Republicans thought they would be facing a president with an economy that wasn't showing much improvement, or getting worse even. That's not the case. Unemployment has been trending down for the last year and a half. With the problems he has with his base, the only way Mitt Romney wins the presidency is if there's a real reversal in the unemployment trend and it heads north of, let's say, 9.5% again. And the opposite seems to be happening. There's every indication that the unemployment numbers will be at or below 8% when election time comes. Then you have what I call Mitt Romney's unique talent. I don't know what else to call it. And he's the all-time world heavyweight champion of waffling. I've never seen anything else like it. I really haven't. I'm not exaggerating. I'm obviously a Democrat, but no other person that I've ever seen has been so all over the place on issues as this guy. Look, every politician has changed their minds on something. I think people will forgive a small amount of that. But people want their president to stand for something. When the Obama campaign starts making videos of Romney being of two or more minds on just about every major issue out there, sometimes with radical swings of opinion in a matter of days or weeks, I think people are going to ask themselves, what, if anything, does this guy stand for? I criticized Gingrich a few weeks ago for some of this, but Newt isn't close to as bad as Romney is when it comes to flip-flops. When you see similar criticisms of a candidate on Democratic Underground and Free Republic, some of the biggest liberal and conservative websites on the internet, respectively, you know that candidate has a problem.
Right.
There's a picture of Romney seen on both websites where Romney has 4 mouths, is reading from a list of policy positions, and Romney is saying to the public, "Stop me when you hear something that you like." Here's the picture. It was drawn by Steve Sack from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. It's a couple of months old, but it's really made the rounds on the internet and continues to make the rounds on the internet. You can't win the presidency with that perception. When it comes to choosing the president, people want a leader, not someone who tries to tell everyone what they want to hear. Let me put it another way. When candidates win their party's nomination, they begin a national conversation with independents and swayable moderates from the other party. The conversation goes something along the lines of, yes, I've been talking like a red meat conservative or liberal for the past 6 to 9 months, but I'm really a reasonable guy, and here's why. Romney can't do that. And he can't do that because he hasn't sewed up his base, and his base is suspicious of his conservative credentials. So Romney now has to fight a two-front war to convince his base he's conservative enough to be worthy of their support, but court moderates and independent Democrats by saying he really isn't that far out there of a conservative. It's just not possible to do that at the same time, particularly with a base that's suspicious of him and has watched him talk out of both sides of his mouth for the last 28 years. Case in point, today Romney made a statement that he's going to concentrate on a message of economic conservatism and ignore social conservative issues because he isn't running to be, quote, pastor-in-chief. That's obviously an attempt to reach out to independents and conservative Democrats, but the religious right is going to be furious with that. Not just with the strategy, but the way he phrased it. You know, I don't think there's anything Romney can say or do to convince the conservative base that he's someone that they should enthusiastically support. And I think he loses to President Obama in the general election for that and the other reasons that I mentioned.